"You're already late. What are you gonna do? Show up in that wrinkled shirt?" Jalen didn't flinch. He stood in the dim hallway of the old Northhaven complex, back against the peeling wall, while the guys from down the block laughed behind him. "Places like that? They don't hire kids like you. Not from here. Not with that last name." He didn't answer, just pulled the strap of his bag tighter across his chest, smoothed the collar of his second-hand shirt, and stepped down the waterlogged stairs. He knew how the city worked. In some buildings, your skin color entered the room before you did, and your address might as well be a red flag. But today he carried more than just a resume. Tucked inside his soaked leather folder were a pair of silver cufflinks, tarnished, old, but his grandfather's, a quiet legacy. And on this rain-drenched morning, when the sky seemed as heavy as the odds stacked against him, Jalen Morris made a single, simple decision: to stop and help a stranger with a flat tire. What he didn't know was that the man behind the wheel could change everything. The streets of Northhaven always looked the same in the early morning. Cracked sidewalks, flickering streetlights, and the low hum of old cars crawling past worn-down apartment blocks. The rain from the previous night still clung to the pavement, turning the gutters into shallow streams. Up ahead, near the bus stop, a group of construction workers sipped coffee from paper cups, their voices low and eyes heavy. A few glanced Jalen's way, their stares lingering, not out of curiosity, but judgment. Jalen Morris adjusted his tie with stiff fingers as he walked by, feeling the weight of their looks settle on him like a brick. He knew what they were thinking. A young black man in a suit walking through Northhaven at 6 o'clock in the morning must be headed to a court date, not a job interview. He had seen that expression his whole life, doubt dressed as indifference. He kept walking, tall and lean, built like a runner, although he hadn't had time for the gym in months. His skin was dark and smooth. He had sharp cheekbones. His mom had always called his serious face the look. Even as a kid, it was a trait he carried. This morning, his jaw was tight, lips pressed together in a thin line. The suit wasn't new. It was a faded navy, tailored just enough to hide the fact that it came off the clearance rack 2 years ago. It clung to his shoulders just as his nerves clung to his chest. Tight, uneasy, unrelenting. He straightened the cuffs. The silver cufflinks glinted softly in the gray morning light. They were his mother's gift, his grandfather's old ones. They didn't match the suit, but they meant more than clothes could. Jalen checked his reflection in the dark window of the corner laundromat. The eyes staring back were steady, but he couldn't quiet the knot twisting in his gut. Today wasn't just a job interview. It was the interview. Langston Holdings, downtown Ridgeport. Glass towers, marble floors, 6-figure salaries, and a strict unspoken rule. You came from the right schools, the right families, the right side of town. Jalen came from Northhaven Public Schools, no trust fund, no legacy, but a perfect GPA from Ridgeport State University, years of grinding through part-time jobs, and a letter of recommendation from Professor Alma Jennings, the only professor who ever looked past where he came from. As he headed toward the train station, his phone buzzed. A text from his mom. "You got this, baby. Just be yourself. I love you." He swallowed the tightness in his throat, tucked the phone away, and kept walking. It didn't matter what those men at the bus stop thought. It didn't matter that the people downtown would look at his skin, his address, and draw their own conclusions before he even opened his mouth. All that mattered was getting into that building, shaking the right hands, and showing them he belonged there. The train hissed to a stop at Monroe Station, the doors sliding open with a mechanical sigh. Jalen stepped out onto the platform, his polished shoes clicking against the damp concrete. The cold morning air smacked him in the face, carrying the bitter smell of wet asphalt and the faint metallic bite of the city. He tugged his coat tighter around him and started toward the exit, weaving past the sea of commuters with their heads down, shoulders hunched, coffee cups steaming in their hands. Everyone moved fast, focused, as they always did downtown. Suits, briefcases, heels tapping, eyes glued to their phones. But even in their rhythm, Jalen noticed something shift. Heads tilted toward the sky, phones lifted, frowns formed. Above the rooftops, the clouds had darkened, thick and low, churning in slow, Angry spirals that didn't belong to an ordinary spring morning. A gust of wind swept down the avenue as Jalen emerged onto the sidewalk, nearly ripping the portfolio from under his arm. He clutched it tighter, his pulse skipping. The pages inside. Extra resumes, notes, market research. Everything he'd worked months for were stacked neatly between thin sheets of leather. His heart pounded harder now, not just from nerves, but the way the air felt heavy, charged, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Ahead, through the breaks in the crowd, he could see the shimmering glass tower of Langston Holdings rising into the gray sky. It looked impossibly tall from here, the upper floors vanishing into the low-hanging clouds. He checked his watch. 8:22 a.m. The interview was at 9 o'clock sharp. Still plenty of time. Then came the first drop of rain. It hit his cheek, cold and sharp, followed by another on the back of his neck. Then more, hundreds, thousands. Falling fast, heavy, relentless. In seconds, it turned into a downpour that soaked his coat, flattened his hair, and sent people scattering beneath awnings and into coffee shops. Umbrellas flipped inside out. Car horns blared as traffic slowed to a crawl. Jalen cursed under his breath and ducked beneath the narrow awning of a bakery, pressing his back against the cold brick, watching as the street flooded with water and frustration. The storm wasn't just rain. It felt like punishment. The weather app had said light showers. This was biblical. He pulled out his phone, fingers slipping on the wet screen, and opened the rideshare app. Nothing. Not a single driver in sight. He refreshed. Still nothing. The storm had shut the city down. His jaw clenched as he checked the time again. 8:31. Still possible if the rain let up. But it didn't. It got worse. Water pooled along the gutters, spilling over curbs. Flyers and trash whipped through the air like confetti from some cruel parade. Across the street, a man slipped and cursed, his briefcase skidding into the flood. Running along the sidewalk, people ducked into storefronts, their suits and designer coats soaked through. Jalen exhaled, trying to steady the tightness building in his chest. It wasn't over yet. He could still make it. It was just water. He zipped the leather portfolio inside his coat, pulled the collar high, and stepped out into the storm. Head down, legs moving fast. Every step was a splash. His polished shoes were now drenched, slapping against pavement slick with rain. His hair stuck to his forehead, his shirt clung to his back. His tie twisted beneath the soaked lapels of his jacket. But he kept moving because this was more than just a job interview. It was escape, it was proof, it was everything. A yellow taxi approached the curb up ahead, brake lights flaring as it let a passenger out. Jalen sprinted, water flying from his shoes, calling out as he raised his hand. But just before he reached it, another man, a tall white guy in a camel trench coat, shoved past him and dove into the back seat. The door slammed. The car sped off, spraying dirty water in its wake. Jalen stopped dead in the street, fists clenched at his sides, jaw tight with frustration. He barely heard the blaring horn as a delivery van swerved around him. His eyes burned. His chest heaved from more than just exertion. He wasn't stupid. He knew how the city worked, who got the cab, who got the benefit of the doubt, who had the doors held open, and who got looked at like they didn't belong. He pressed on, wiping the rain from his eyes, ignoring the ache in his legs, the gnawing pit in his stomach. His mind screamed, "Keep going. Just get there. You can still fix this." The tower was close now, just over the next few blocks. He could see the faint glow of the building's lobby lights through the rain, so close it made his chest tighten with desperate hope. Then he saw the car. It was parked just off the main street. Sleek and black, the kind that cost more than his mom made in a year. The back tire sagged low, flat against the pavement. The trunk hung open, a spare tire half pulled out, and next to it, struggling beneath a battered umbrella, was an old man, white, silver-haired, probably in his late 60s or early 70s. His suit was wrinkled and soaked, hands fumbling with the jack as it slipped and wobbled on the wet asphalt. Jalen slowed, his pulse still racing, rain running down his face as he took in the scene. No one else had stopped. Pedestrians hurried past, eyes down, shoulders hunched. Pretending not to notice, a couple walked by on the other side of the street, the woman pulling her boyfriend along, her eyes flicking toward the man then away just as fast. Jalen stood frozen, caught between instinct and ambition. His gaze drifted back to the glowing tower beyond the traffic. The interview was his shot, his one shot. He had already lost precious minutes. His clothes were ruined, and his confidence was hanging by a thread. Walk away. His brain whispered, someone else will help. You've worked too damn hard to throw it away now. But his feet didn't move. Instead, his mother's voice echoed in the back of his mind. The same words she drilled into him as a boy when he'd ignored the old woman struggling with groceries outside their apartment. You don't help people when it's convenient, Jalen. You help them because that's who you are. That's what separates a man from just another face in the crowd. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled tighter around the soaked leather portfolio. Screw it, sir, Jalen called out, crossing the street, his shoes splashing through the flooded curb. Let me help you with that. The old man looked up, surprise flashing across his face, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. I thought I had it, he stammered, his voice thin with frustration and exhaustion. But this damn jack, it's slipping because the ground's uneven. Jalen cut in gently, setting his portfolio carefully on the back seat, praying it wouldn't soak through any worse than it already had. He shrugged off his jacket, laying it on the wet pavement without hesitation. You shouldn't be out in this storm, sir. The old man's eyes softened, the stubborn lines around his mouth easing just slightly. Storm caught me off guard. My driver's out sick. I haven't changed a tire myself in 20 years. Jalen knelt down beside the car, hands moving with practiced ease, checking the jack placement, adjusting the angle. The cold metal bit into his palms, but muscle memory took over. Summers in Northhaven, working with his uncle at the auto shop, changing flats on rusted pickups. It all came flooding back. You know your way around a wrench, the old man observed, watching him work. Jalen chuckled under his breath, fingers tightening the bolts. Uncle never let me drive his old Chevy till I could swap a tire in under 10 minutes. The man gave a soft laugh, the sound barely cutting through the rain. Smart man. The clock kept ticking. Jalen could feel every second sliding away like water down the street. But he didn't rush. He finished the job properly, standing up as the last bolt clicked into place. The old man straightened, offering a hand. What's your name, son? Jalen. Jalen Morris. The man's eyes sharpened just for a moment. A flicker of curiosity. You headed somewhere important, Jalen? Jalen hesitated, wiping grease and water onto his soaked slacks. His pulse thudded in his ears. The interview, the tower, his future. Yeah, he said finally, voice steady despite the storm. The most important place I've ever gone. The sedan rolled to a smooth stop in front of Langston Holdings, its black paint slick with rain. The engine purred low beneath the steady thrum of water pelting the windshield. Jalen stared out the window, his heart sinking as his eyes locked on the building's towering glass facade. The lobby glowed with soft golden light beyond the entrance, clean and polished, untouched by the chaos still raging in the streets. His reflection in the car window stared back, soaked, wrinkled, a mess. He barely recognized himself. You sure you still want to go in there looking like that? The old man asked gently from behind the wheel, his voice steady but not unkind. Jalen forced a tight smile, his jaw clenched. I have to try. The man gave a small nod, eyes unreadable, fingers tapping once against the steering wheel. Jalen shoved open the door, wincing as cold rain smacked him in the face again. The storm had eased but not disappeared. Puddles reflected the marble steps leading up to the building like distorted mirrors. His shoes squelched with every step, soaked through. The once polished leather was now dull and stained. His jacket hung heavy on his shoulders, useless against the water and wind. His dress shirt plastered to his skin. Inside, the world changed. The lobby was another reality entirely, warm, silent, immaculate. High ceilings stretched above, gleaming marble floors. Abstract art installations hung on pristine white walls. A soft floral scent lingered in the air, clean and expensive, the kind of place where everything was designed to intimidate. Without a word, Jalen hesitated for half a second by the glass doors, conscious of the water dripping from his clothes onto the polished floor. His appearance drawing quick, subtle glances from the suited professionals moving through the space. A man in an expensive coat glanced at him with thinly veiled disapproval. A receptionist across the room whispered to her coworker, eyes darting toward Jalen, lips curving in a small, amused smirk. He ignored them. He had to. The security desk stood near the elevators, sleek and white like everything else in this place. Behind it, a tall guard in a navy blazer tapped on a tablet, eyes flicking up as Jalen approached. His gaze sharpened the moment he took in Jalen's state. Wet, disheveled, clearly out of place. The guard straightened, lips pressing into a thin professional line. "Good morning," Jalen said, forcing his voice steady and adjusting the soaked leather portfolio under his arm. "My name's Jalen Morris. I have a 9 o'clock interview with Langston Holdings Finance Division." The guard's eyes narrowed, tapping at his tablet. Jalen could feel the seconds dragging out, his heartbeat pounding in his ears as the man scrolled through the list. "Yes, Mr. Morris," the guard finally said. "Finance team, 14th floor." He paused, fingers hovering above the screen. "I should let you know they're strict about timing." Jalen exhaled, nodding once. "I understand." He cut himself off. There was no point explaining, not to him. The guard gestured toward the elevator bank. "You can try, but no promises." Jalen thanked him quietly and walked across the floor, every soggy step echoing embarrassingly loud against the stone. His reflection stared back at him in the mirrored elevator doors. Shirt clinging to his chest, collar limp, cuffs wrinkled, pants stained with street water. His tie looked like it had been melted onto his skin. The professional image he'd spent 2 years building was gone. All that remained was the young man from Northhaven standing in a place not built for him. The elevator dinged. The ride-up was too fast, too quiet. When the doors opened onto the 14th floor, the space beyond felt like another level of a world he didn't belong to. Dark hardwood floors, frosted glass partitions, framed cityscape photographs lining the walls. A receptionist in a sleek gray blazer sat behind a curved desk, typing briskly. Her fingers slowed as she looked up and saw him. Surprise flickered across her carefully made-up face, followed by a brief professional mask of neutrality. "Good morning," Jalen began, clearing his throat and adjusting his grip on the damp portfolio. "I'm Jalen Morris. I had a 9 o'clock interview scheduled." She checked the clock on the wall behind her. 9:18. Her eyes softened slightly, but her posture stayed firm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morris," she said, voice low but not unkind. "That would have been with Mr. Calloway. Unfortunately, he's moved on to the next candidates. He has a tight schedule." Jalen's stomach twisted. He had known this was coming, but hearing it aloud, feeling the finality in her tone, made it land like a fist to the ribs. He opened his mouth, struggling to stay composed. "I know I'm late. The storm, I tried to get here. There was an elderly man stranded with a flat tire. I couldn't just." She lifted a hand gently, her eyes flicking toward the office doors beyond. "Mr. Morris, I understand, but Mr. Calloway." Her voice trailed off. There was no leeway here, no room for exceptions. Jalen swallowed hard. The words lodged in his throat, turning to bitter dust. "Could you at least tell him I came? That I tried?" His voice cracked slightly despite his efforts to sound steady. He opened his portfolio, pulling out one of the few surviving resumes. The edges warped, the ink on the corners smudged, but mostly legible. He offered it to her with careful fingers. The receptionist hesitated, then took it, nodding faintly. "I'll make sure he gets this," she promised, a trace of sympathy softening her professional expression. For a moment, their eyes held, hers calm, his raw with frustration and quiet heartbreak. Then the moment passed. Jalen turned toward the elevators, his steps heavy, shoes still squishing softly with every move. His shoulders sagged under the weight of the morning, the storm, the lost opportunity, the sting of knowing he had done the right thing and still lost. The elevator doors opened with a sterile chime. He stepped inside, staring blankly at his reflection in the mirrored walls. Watching the water drip from his coat onto the clean floor, his chest tightened as the doors slid shut, cutting him off from the office, from the dream, from everything he'd fought so hard for. The ride down was silent, too quiet. The polished lobby greeted him again with its sharp edges and clean lines. As he stepped back out into the world, the storm had eased. Sunlight cut through the thinning clouds, glinting off the wet pavement outside. Jalen paused near the glass doors, staring out at the street. His jaw clenched, throat tight. The world kept moving. Cars honked, people hurried past, no one noticing the soaked young man standing there, carrying disappointment like a second skin. He didn't rage, he didn't cry. He just walked out the door, back into the city, back into the unknown, dreams trailing behind him like the rain still dripping from his ruined jacket. The morning sun over Northhaven didn't care about Jalen Morris's disappointment. It pushed through the thin curtains of his apartment, casting pale strips of light across the peeling paint of the walls and the small battered kitchen table where he sat hunched over his laptop. The hum of old radiators filled the silence. Outside, sirens wailed somewhere down the block. Life in Northhaven never slowed for anybody's bad day. Jalen stared at the glowing screen in front of him, his fingers frozen over the keyboard. His resume stared back, cursor blinking like a quiet reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The words blurred. The creases in the leather portfolio on the table caught his eye. The edges were still warped, the surface stained from rain and street grime. He had dried it as best he could last night, laying it by the old fan in the corner. But the damage was there, permanent like a scar. His suit jacket hung from a nail on the wall, the faint outline of water stains ghosting across the fabric. No dry cleaner in the world able to erase them completely. A symbol, maybe, or just another quiet defeat. His phone buzzed against the tabletop, jolting him out of his haze. His mom's face filled the screen's soft eyes, the same determined curve of the jaw he saw in the mirror every morning. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the answer button. He hadn't told her yet. Not the whole truth. She'd been so proud when he got the interview. She'd even mailed him his grandfather's cufflinks wrapped in tissue paper, still carrying the faint scent of her lavender soap. The same cufflinks now sitting in the pocket of his ruined jacket. The phone kept buzzing. Jalen took a breath and pressed accept, forcing his voice steady. "Hey Ma, baby, I've been thinking about you all morning," she said, the familiar warmth of her voice cutting through his tangled frustration. "Any news? Did you hear back from that big shot company?" His mouth opened, the words sitting bitter on his tongue. How could he explain it? That he'd made it all the way there, that he'd sacrificed everything to do the right thing and still lost, that no one cared about a young black man from Northhaven with good intentions and wet clothes. Before he could answer, another call buzzed in, flashing across the top of the screen. Unknown number, Ridgeport area code. "Ma, I gotta take this, it could be about a job." "Of course, honey. Go get M." He switched lines, nerves tightening in his chest like a coiled spring. "Hello, Mr. Morris," a woman's voice said, crisp and professional, radiating the smooth confidence of someone used to making important calls. "This is Savannah Brooks, executive assistant to Mr. Edward Langston. I'm calling on his behalf to invite you to a meeting this afternoon at 2 o'clock, if you're available." Jalen blinked, the world tilting slightly under him. He gripped the phone tighter, his voice barely catching up to his racing thoughts. "Wait, I'm sorry. Did you say Mr. Langston?" "The CEO." "Yes, sir." Her tone didn't waver. "The meeting will be on the executive floor, 82nd level. Would you like directions to the building?" His heart pounded. Every instinct screamed this couldn't be real. It had to be some misunderstanding, a courtesy rejection maybe, or a formality. But he heard nothing in her voice to suggest that, just quiet efficiency. Like this was the most normal request in the world. "No, I know where it is." "Excellent. We look forward to seeing you, Mr. Morris." The line clicked dead. leaving Jalen frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. For a moment, all he could hear was the low hum of the apartment, the distant sound of a TV from the neighboring unit, the rhythmic tap of his heartbeat pounding in his chest. He set the phone down slowly, eyes fixed on the leather portfolio. This couldn't be happening. Jalen shot up from the chair, nearly knocking his coffee mug onto the floor. He snatched his jacket from the wall, running his fingers over the stained fabric, his mind already racing through what came next. This time there wouldn't be rain, no rushing through flooded streets, no missed chances. By 12:30, his suit was pressed as crisp as it could get under the circumstances. His shoes, though scarred from the storm, were polished until the leather gleamed faintly again. He'd spent nearly an hour buffing them, as if scrubbing away the memory of the soaked streets. The humiliation in that marble lobby. The cufflinks clicked into place at his wrists, silver and simple. The faintest reflection of light glinted off them as he straightened his sleeves. At exactly 1:17 p.m., a yellow cab pulled up in front of the gleaming Langston Holdings building. The storm clouds were gone now, replaced by a clear, sharp blue sky that stretched over the city like a fresh start. The air was crisp, the sidewalk still damp but drying fast under the sunlight. Jalen stepped out, adjusted his tie, and stared up at the tower. It didn't seem so impossibly tall this time, still intimidating, still the symbol of wealth and power he'd spent years trying to reach. But today it wasn't chasing him. Today he'd been invited inside. The lobby felt familiar now. The same polished floors, the same hushed air of quiet authority, but the stairs were different. The man at the security desk barely glanced up before scanning his name and handing over a black access badge with a gold emblem shimmering under the lights. Executive access, the guard confirmed, his voice holding no judgment this time, just protocol. Jalen walked toward the elevators, the black badge cool in his hand, his pulse steady despite the surge of adrenaline rising beneath his skin. The mirrored elevator doors slid shut, his reflection staring back. Sharper now, steadier. A man who still had questions, still carried doubt, but wasn't running anymore. As the numbers climbed higher, his chest tightened, but not with fear. Something else. Anticipation, possibility. 82 floors later, the doors opened to a different world entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched along the hall, pouring sunlight across a space filled with clean lines, expensive furniture, and carefully placed artwork that probably cost more than his entire apartment building. A woman in a navy suit approached with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged here. Her smile was professional but not cold. "Mr. Morris, I'm Savannah Brooks. We spoke earlier." "Yeah," Jalen replied, his voice steady despite the quiet storm still pulsing under his skin. "We did. Mr. Langston will see you shortly. Can I get you anything while you wait?" "Coffee? Water?" "Water's good, thank you." Savannah returned quickly with a crystal glass, untouched, gleaming under the sunlight. She gestured toward the tall double doors at the end of the corridor. "When he's ready, I'll let you know. Make yourself comfortable." Jalen sat, glass in hand, his gaze fixed on the doors that stood between him and the answers waiting on the other side. His heartbeat steadied. Every breath grew slower, measured. He didn't know why this was happening. He didn't know what waited beyond those doors. But for the first time in days, cautious hope began to rise. Slow, quiet, undeniable. The double doors clicked open with a quiet, deliberate sound that carried more weight than it should have. Savannah stepped back slightly, her voice low but clear. "Mr. Langston will see you now." Jalen stood, the black badge cool against his chest, his fingers tightening briefly around the leather portfolio. He let out a slow breath and stepped forward, each stride steady despite the quiet thud of his heartbeat in his ears. The office beyond the doors wasn't what he expected. It wasn't overly grand or dripping in excess. It was large, yes, but understated. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the sprawl of Ridgeport below, skyscrapers punching through the clear afternoon sky. The furniture was sleek, dark wood, leather, marble, all expensive, all simple. It spoke of old money, quiet confidence, and someone who had nothing left to prove. A high-backed chair faced the windows, the silhouette of a man just visible against the sunlight. Slowly, the chair turned. The face that met Jalen wasn't unfamiliar. Silver hair, sharp eyes. The same steady expression of the old man stranded on the street wrestling with a flat tire and a stubborn jack. But here, in the space, he looked different. Not vulnerable, not frustrated, just powerful. "Mr. Morris," he said simply, extending a hand across the polished desk. "Good to see you again." Jalen hesitated a fraction of a second before stepping forward, gripping the older man's hand. It was firm, grounded, the kind of handshake that carried weight. I didn't realize," Jalen admitted quietly, the words sticking slightly in his throat. "Out there on the street, I didn't know that I was the man who signed your interview invitation." Edward finished, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's exactly why it mattered." Jalen blinked, uncertainty tightening in his chest. I missed the interview. I thought that was it." Edward gestured to the chairs arranged across from his desk, moving with practiced, quiet ease. "Sit." Jalen obeyed, sinking into the cool leather, his hands resting on the damp, worn portfolio now perched on his lap. Edward didn't speak immediately. He moved to the windows, clasping his hands behind his back, his gaze drifting over the city like a man surveying his legacy. 58 years ago, Edward began, his voice calm, carrying the weight of memory. "I stood in a factory outside Pittsburgh. Cheap suit, nervous, out of my depth. I asked a man 3 times my age to believe in an idea I could barely articulate." He turned slightly, the sunlight outlining the lines on his face, the sharp intelligence in his eyes. He said yes. "Changed my life. This company, it doesn't exist without that moment." Jalen watched him, every muscle tight with focus, his heart pounding. Not from fear now, but from the possibility creeping in at the edges. Edward moved back to his desk, opening a drawer with quiet precision. He pulled out the leather portfolio Jalen had left behind days ago. The edges still warped, stained by rain, the pages inside slightly curled. "You left this in my car," Edward said, placing it gently on the desk between them. "I took the liberty of reading it." Jalen swallowed, his throat dry, eyes flicking to the battered portfolio. Part of him wanted to apologize for its condition. The other part was too aware that nothing about the storm that morning could be undone now. Edward opened the folder, sliding a few of the pages forward. "Your market analysis on Southeast Asia sharp. Your cover letter, honest, personal, rare." He looked up, eyes steady. "But none of that's why you're here." Jalen's fingers twitched slightly, nerve stirring. "It's not." Edward shook his head once, measured, deliberate. "I've been hiring people for decades, Jalen. I can't teach finance. I can train someone to read a balance sheet or build a portfolio, but I can't teach character." His words hung in the space between them, simple yet heavy with meaning. Most people standing in your shoes that morning, wet, cold, late, would have kept walking. I wouldn't have blamed them. You didn't. Jalen stayed quiet. The memory of the rain, the frustration, and the quiet voice of his mother in his head all flooding back at once. "You stopped," Edward continued. "You helped. Not because there were cameras, not because someone was watching, but because it was the right thing to do." He sat back, folding his hands calmly on the desk. "I've built this company on decisions made in quiet moments when no one's watching. That morning, you showed me everything I needed to know." Jalen's throat tightened, a knot of disbelief, pride, and the quiet ache of validation rising all at once. I appreciate that, sir, more than I can explain." Edward's eyes softened slightly, the corners crinkling. "I'm not offering you an analyst position, Jalen. Not the entry-level spot you came here for." For a fleeting second, Jalen's heart sank, the words landing heavy, sharp, but Edward wasn't finished. "I'm offering you something else." He leaned forward, his voice dropping with quiet certainty. "You'll work directly with me, special assistant. You'll sit in rooms most people spend a decade clawing their way toward. You'll listen, learn, observe. It won't be easy. It won't always be comfortable, but you'll leave with a foundation no textbook or classroom can buy. Jalen stared at him, the offer settling into his chest like something solid, real, and terrifying in its size. Well, me? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Raw, vulnerable, coated in years of knowing how many doors were locked before he even reached them. Edward smiled, the kind of smile that came from remembering how it felt to be young, uncertain, underestimated, because someone once believed in me before I deserved it, and it changed everything. He extended his hand again, calm, steady, the weight of opportunity sitting between them. Jalen reached out, his fingers closing around Edward Langston's with quiet strength. Not as the nervous, drenched young man who had knocked on locked doors, but as someone seen, chosen, respected. The rainstorm hadn't drowned his chance. It had revealed it, and for the first time in his life, Jalen Morris walked toward his future, knowing he'd earned every step. If the story moved you even just a little, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories that reveal the strength and kindness. And turn on the bell so you never miss a moment that could change how you see the world. Sometimes the smallest choice opens the biggest door.